Hello, everyone. Uh, I am Halil Yenigun. I am the Associate Director of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. Today, we are pleased to host a webinar with so many of our campus partners. Um, so we are today going to have Hayatullah Ahmadzai with us, who is going to present his talk and his research with Oliver Morrissey. And today we are going to be joined by David Lobell from he's Benjamin Page Professor, William Ragley Senior Fellow at the FSI at Stanford, and also he is the Director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment. He's going to be the moderator. We got together with so many different parts of the campus for today. Abbasi, in addition to Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies, we have Center for South Asia, Center on Food Security and the Environment, and this whole event was initiated by the Middle Eastern Studies Association's Global Academy. We thank all of our partners for joining us to make this possible. And I'm now handing it over to David to take the rest of it here.
Great. Thank you, Halil. So we're very excited at FSC to help sponsor this event. We've been looking forward to it. And I have the honor of introducing Hayat. So I'll tell you a little bit about his background and then turn it over to him. So Hayat Ahmadzai is an applied economist and an external research fellow at the Center for Research in Economic Development and International Trade, which is at the University of Nottingham in the UK, although he's based now in North Carolina. From 2011 to 2015, he was an assistant professor at Kabul University in Afghanistan. He holds a Ph.D. in development and agricultural economics from the University of Nottingham and a master's degree in agricultural and applied economics from Purdue University. His research spans over a decade of academic and policy-oriented work across South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa region, Sub-Saharan Africa, and it really focuses on the intersection of agricultural development, rural livelihoods, and climate resilience, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected contexts such as Afghanistan and Iraq. He uses applied econometrics and causal inference methods. His work looks at specifically how agricultural systems respond to shocks from conflict and market failures to environmental stressors like sand and dust storms. And so today, Hayat will be talking to us about his work in Afghanistan on climate shocks, household food security, and welfare. Just want to, before handing it over to him, remind you, as a webinar, you won't be able to, we won't be able to see anything you put in chat, but if you use the Q&A, I encourage you to enter all of your questions in there, and then when Hayat is done speaking, I'll moderate a session where I bring in those questions. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. We have until 1:30 California time, but we'll probably spend about half of that, hopefully, on the discussion after Hayat's comments. So with that, Hayat, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, David, and Halil for introducing the session. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody joining from different locations. Let me begin by warmly welcoming you to this webinar, to this session, and thank you for taking the time to attend to this presentation. Like David said, my name is Hayatullah Ahmadzai, and I'm presenting a joint work with Professor Oliver Morrissey, who is a professor and director of the Center for Research in Economic Development and International Trade, or as we call it, CREDIT, at the University of Nottingham in the UK. This presentation is titled Climate Shocks, Household Food Security and Welfare in Afghanistan. So before I go into the presentation, I would like to briefly acknowledge the institutional context around this work. This research is affiliated with credit at the University of Nottingham, and I'm very grateful for financial and institutional support for the Council for At-Risk Scholars Academics, or CARA in the UK, and the Institute of International Education Scholars Rescue Fund, or IIESRF, which supported this work during its development. So Zareen, if you can take us to the next slide, so I can acknowledge the organizers and the hosts, please. Although Halil introduced the organizers, and I would also like to take a moment to express my appreciation to the organizers and the hosts for the invitation and the opportunity to present this work, namely the MISA Global Academy, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford Center for Food Security and Environment, and Stanford's Center for South Asia. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share and discuss this research in such a setting. Thank you. If you could take us to the next slide so I can introduce the talk a little bit to the content slide, please. Moving on, let me now briefly outline the structure of the presentation so you know what to expect. Today I'll be talking about climate shocks, in particular how they affect household food security and welfare in Afghanistan. I should also note that this study was initially published as a credit research paper and has since been published in Food Policy, but I would still very much welcome comments, suggestion, and critical feedback. So the presentation is organized in actually in 7 main parts. I'll start with the introduction and some background, and then move on to introduce the Afghan context, followed by a quick literature overview and main research gaps. First, I will, with the introduction, and then go to the context and motivation, and then focus on climate shocks and food security and how they are particularly an important issue in Afghanistan. Then move to the main research gaps and discuss the data and empirical strategy before I finally turn to the results and concluding with some policy implications. If time permits, I'll also briefly discuss robustness checks and additional results that are included in the appendix for just in case. With that, could you please take me to the next slide? Okay. Let me now begin with the broader motivation and the context of the study. The central question we ask is how climate shocks, particularly natural disasters such as floods, affect household food security and welfare outcome. This question is increasingly important given the rising frequency and intensity of climate-related shocks globally, and especially in developing and fragile contexts like Afghanistan. As highlighted in the literature, including Dell and Helgate and co-authors, climate shocks are not only simply environmental events. There are also economic shocks in that sense, with direct implications for consumptions, income, and welfare. A key concern is that the impacts of these shocks are not evenly distributed. The research shows that poor households are disproportionately affected because they typically have fewer assets, limited access to credit markets, and are characterized by weak coping mechanisms. As a result, even relatively short-term shocks can translate into long-term welfare losses, particularly through reduction in food consumption and nutritional intake. In addition, there's growing evidence that climate shocks can have broader societal consequences, especially in this context, including worsening inequality in some contexts, contributing to social instability and potentially conflicts. The literature shows again, for example, it highlights potential links between natural disasters and conflict risk, particularly in fragile settings like Afghanistan. So again, this brings us to Afghanistan, which is particularly an important case study for this analysis. What makes Afghanistan especially relevant is that it represents a setting where multiple vulnerabilities overlap. For instance, high exposure to climate shock, widespread poverty in the context of long-standing fragility in conflict. Yet, despite this, there is still relatively limited micro-level evidence on how these shocks translate into household-level food security and welfare outcomes. So overall, the objective of the study is to provide empirical evidence on how exposures to natural disasters affect food security and welfare at the household level, using detailed survey data and multiple identification strategies. And next slide, please. So let me now turn to the Afghan context, which is central to this study, just to focus a bit more why we're doing this work. Afghanistan is particularly interesting because vulnerabilities here are not isolated. They are layered and reinforcing. First, in terms of exposure, Afghanistan is one of the most disaster-prone countries globally. This is due to the combination of factors that I mentioned before, its mountainous geography and its exposure to seismic activity, ongoing climate change, and of course, the added constraints from prolonged and protracted conflict. In fact, it's ranked among the most vulnerable countries globally, as per the ND-GAIN index, which is the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Index, which captures both exposure and adaptive capacity. Second, the economy is highly dependent on agriculture. Roughly 44% of the workforce is employed in agriculture, and about 60% of households derive at least part of their income from it. So when shocks hit, floods, droughts, or earthquakes, they directly translate into income and consumption shocks for a large share of the population. Third, the country is already facing a severe food insecurity crisis, especially with the recent, through the changes throughout the recent years. So over 17.2 million, which makes up 40% of the population, is experiencing acute food insecurity and a significant share in emergency condition. So households are not just vulnerable to shocks. Many are already operating at the edge of subsistence. And on top of this, of course, as we discussed, we have the conflict dimension. Decades of conflicts have weakened infrastructures, markets, and coping capacities. And importantly, there is evidence that conflict and disasters interact, with even small increases in fatalities leading to large declines in consumption, research show. So the key takeaway from this slide really is simple. In Afghanistan, climate vulnerability, poverty, and conflict are not separate issues. They reinforce each other. With that, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. In terms of exposure, first, climate and natural shocks affect a very large share of the population. Estimates suggest that around 60% people are affected in some form by these natural disasters. And beyond climate shocks, about 1 in 5 households also reports exposure to security-related shocks as per the World Bank, and our data show the same. If we take a look at the physical impacts over time, the numbers are also significant. More than 16,000 deaths have been recorded from earthquakes and floods since 1990. And in terms of economic damage, the losses are substantial as well. Floods alone are estimated at around $54 million annually, earthquakes around 80 million, and droughts could reach up to several billion dollars annually. What is also important is that these shocks are not only large, but recurring. For example, avalanches and landslides are other frequently and common shocks that block key transport routes. For example, the Salang Pass, which is a critical connection corridor. And earthquakes are not rare events either. There have been roughly 100 damaging earthquakes over the last century. So again, the message here is not just exposure; it's repeated exposure over time, often in some of the most vulnerable regions of the world. Next slide, please. So this takes us to the research gaps in the contribution part. There are 3 main gaps that this study tries to address. First, despite the importance of Afghanistan as a case, as I explained before, there is still limited micro-level empirical evidence on how climate shocks affect household welfare and other outcomes, especially in the short run. Second, existing studies often rely on relatively small samples or focus on narrow measures of food security, which limits comparability. And third, and most importantly, there is still limited causal evidence, especially in conflict-affected contexts where identification is more challenging. I'll talk about this later. So the question is, what do we do differently here? Well, firstly, we use large scale nationally representative data covering more than 40,000 households across 2 survey views. Secondly, we use multiple indicators for food security, including hunger, dietary diversity, coping mechanism or strategies, and consumption expenditure. And methodologically, we go beyond simple correlations or descriptive statistics. We employ a range of approaches, including OLS, instrumental variables, fixed effects in propensity score matching, and other that I'll address later. To address some of the concerning estimation issues that might arise because of the limitation of the data. And finally, we look at heterogeneity, and by this I mean how effects differ depending on exposure to conflict and additional shocks. So the contribution, just to summarize, is really threefold. We use better data, multidimensional measurements for food security, and stronger identification given the context. With that, can we please go to the next slide so I can talk about some of why is this work particularly relevant to policy and what the implications might be. Well, first, the findings are directly relevant for climate resilience and disaster risk management. They show how climate and conflict shocks jointly shape household welfare, particularly food security. Second, they speak to targeting. If we understand which household in which regions are most vulnerable, then both humanitarian and response in social protection can be better designed. Third, this is an increasingly important one as climate risks intensify globally. Understanding micro-level impacts is essential to preventing long-term welfare losses. And while the focus is here is on Afghanistan, the broader implications could extend to other fragile and conflict-affected settings, such as maybe part of Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria, where similar overlaps between climate stress, poverty, and instability exist. Next slide, please. Okay, and this brings us to the research questions. The first question is, how does exposure to natural disaster affect household food security and welfare outcomes in Afghanistan? That takes us to the second question, how do these effects vary across different dimensions, including hunger, dietary diversity, coping strategies, and consumption? And the third question is, how does exposures to additional shocks, particularly conflict and insecurity, interact with climate shocks in shaping household vulnerability? Taken together, these questions can help us move from correlation to more structured understanding of vulnerability in fragile settings. Next slide, please. Here we'll focus on the data. So having set up the context, what's the data that we use for our analysis? Well, the study draws on household survey data from Afghanistan Living Conditions Survey, or as they call it, ALCS, which is conducted by the National Statistics and Information Authority of Afghanistan with support from the World Bank and the European Commission. Well, this is a nationally representative data covering two waves conducted in 2011 to 12 and 2013 and 14. It uses a fairly standard stratified sampling design covering all provinces, including rural, urban, in nomadic or the Kuchi populations. The local term is Kuchi, which are the landless herders mainly. In terms of structure, the survey follows a two-stage cluster design. In the first stage, enumeration areas are selected, what they are also called shuras in local language. And then households are sampled within each cluster, which is each shura in this case. Overall, we have around 21,000 households surveyed per view, and when pooled, it just gives over 40,000 households as a sample. But after cleaning the data and excluding a small share of Kuchi populations, which I mentioned are systematically different, they don't own land or operate agriculture, and they're moving. So we excluded, and then the final analytical sample is just under 40,000. Now, in terms of why this data set is useful for our purposes, there are three key strengths. First, it's a repeated cross-section, which allows us to compare outcomes over time. By the way, this is the only household level data set available for Afghanistan. In ideal situation, it would have been better if we had a panel data, but a repeated cross-section is still better than a survey that is done at one point in time, in simple words. Second, the data are geo-reference. which means we can merge household data with other district level informations on shocks, climate variables, as well as conflict, which is an important factor here. And third, it provides rich information not just on income and consumption, but also on food shocks and household characteristics. So overall, this gives us a foundation to analyze how shocks translate into household level outcomes. Next slide, so I can begin to explain some of the additional data sources that we've used in this analysis. So beyond the household survey, which is the primary data set, we also incorporate additional data particularly to better capture exposure to shocks, additional shocks such as conflict. For conflict and security, we use two types of measures. First, this is part of the ALS, the household survey, which is a self-reported variable that indicates whether the household experienced insecurity in the past 12 months. And second, we use district level data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, or UCDP, which captures fatalities and violent incidents at the district level. This allows us to move beyond perception-based measures and include more objective indicators, especially for conflict and in its intensity. On the climate side, we use district level data on temperature and precipitation. These come from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast, or ECMWF, a 5 global climate data set, which provides high resolution weather information. So combining these sources, we're harmonizing a database with which we're able to capture both household level experiences in broader environmental and conflict condition. Next slide, please. This takes us to how do we measure key outcome variables? What are the key outcome? We keep saying outcome variables, household outcomes. So how do we construct these variables and how do we measure them? We focus on two broad categories, basically: food security and household welfare. Starting with food security, we use a set of widely used multidimensional indicators. These are based on self-reporting information on food access, coping behavior, and hunger. In particular, we use three main measures. The first is household food consumption score, or food consumption score, which is primarily a dietary diversity measure, which captures food access and consumption frequency. It is based on the number of days, over 7 days recall period. The household consume foods basically from 9 standard groups. Each group is assigned a weight by the WEP based on nutritional value of each food group. Once constructed, the HFCS indicator ranges from 0 to 112, with higher values indicating better food security outcomes. The second is the household hunger scale, or HHS. This captures more like severe food access constraints. HHS is based on 3 questions about households' experiences with hunger, asking how often they face different levels of hunger in the past 30 days. So it's based on a 30-day recall period for the survey. The total household the total HHS indicator, once constructed, ranges from 0 to 6, with 6 showing the highest degree of hunger. And the third one is reduced coping strategy index. This reflects the extent to which households rely on coping strategies, such as reducing meals or switching to less preferred foods, maybe perhaps. RCSI measures how often household used. This is based on 5 food-related coping strategies over the past 7 days. So it's based on 7-day recall period at the survey. With each strategy is then weighted by how severe it is, and the scores are added together. Again, higher scores, which could range to up to 56, indicate worse or severe coping. If time allows, we can go over how each of these measures is constructed in detail. So together, these measures allow us to capture different dimensions of food security and the welfare side. We also look at income, farm revenue, and food consumption expenditures. And all measures are constructed per adult equivalent, and they are inflation adjusted. And we also consider the share of food expenditure, which is often used as an indicator of vulnerability. Expenditure, the share of food expenditures in total household expenditure is the actual measure. So overall, we're not relying on a single measure, but rather a set of indicators, and together they provide a more complete picture of household welfare rather than relying on a single indicator. That takes us to the next slide, please. Let me explain how we measure exposure to shocks, which is our key variable of interest here. For natural disaster, we use a simple binary indicator equal to 1 if the household reported experiencing such events, such as floods, earthquakes, landslides, or avalanches in the past 12 months. And this again comes from the ALCS survey, which is the main data set here. In addition to that, we control for other types of shocks. These include conflict, price shocks, and weather-related shocks, such as frost or hail. For conflict, as I mentioned earlier, we combine both household self-reported measures and district-level data, like number of fatal incidents at the district level. We also include a set of standard household controls, such as household head age, education, household size, household composition, which is measured by dependency ratio, as well as we account for local characteristics, which is locational or geographical characteristics, by including whether the household is in the rural area or urban area, in basic terrain features. So the idea is to isolate the effect of natural disasters while controlling for other factors that might also affect household welfare and food security outcomes. And next slide, please. So, okay. In this slide, I'll explain some summary statistics from the data, which will give us a sense of how common disaster exposure is in the data. This table shows the distribution of households by exposure status in each survey round, as well as in the pooled sample. Remember, we pulled the two surveys together. and we analyzed the analysis took a course to analyze each survey separately as well as the pooled sample. So looking at the pooled sample here, like I mentioned before, around 21% the household report being affected by natural disasters. Roughly 1 in 5 households. There is some variation, of course, across survey views. Exposure is slightly higher for in 2011 and 12 compared to the later year, which is 13 and 14. But the key takeaway here is that disaster exposure is not rare. It affects a substantial share of households. Next slide, please. Some more descriptive statistics. I don't know, the table looks kind of populated, but I try to summarize it the best way I could. What we do here is compare households that are affected by natural disasters with those that are not affected. And the patterns are quite consistent. Affected households tend to have lower food consumption scores, meaning worse access in dietary diversity. They also report higher level of hunger and rely more on severe coping strategies as measured by HHI and RCSI, which I defined before in the previous slides. In terms of welfare, they have lower income, lower farm revenue, and lower food expenditures for the affected group. And at the same time, food makes up for a larger share of the total consumption, something we usually would see with subsistent behavior and coping mechanisms when disasters hit, and it's overall a sign of vulnerability for the affected group. Another important point is that shocks tend to overlap, like I mentioned in the beginning. Households affected by natural disasters are also more likely to experience conflict, price shocks, and other weather-related shocks. So this reinforces the idea that vulnerability is, in fact, a multidimensional, not driven by a single factor. Next slide, please. Okay, so this figure in this slide presents basically the same idea, but visually what I discussed in the previous slide. I showed that the distribution of the 3 food security indicators, the HFCS, RCSI, and HHI for households that are affected versus non-affected using predefined cutoffs. Again, if time allows, we can also discuss how and why these cutoffs were identified. And the pattern is quite clear again. Affected households are more likely to fall into worse categories: higher hunger, more coping behavior, and lower dietary diversity. So this provides a visual confirmation of the descriptive results that we just discussed before. Next slide, please. I would like to talk about the special aspect of natural disasters, given we're focusing on the whole country, Afghanistan. I would like to briefly discuss this dimension of natural disasters. One important aspect of the data is that disasters are widespread. Most districts throughout the country experience at least one type of disaster. Floods, though floods are by far the most common, accounting for nearly 70% of all events. And there are clear regional patterns. Floods tend to occur more in central, eastern, and northern region, while earthquakes and related hazards are typically more concentrated and mountainous in seismically active areas, as one would imagine. So again, geography plays an important role in shaping exposure. Next slide, please. So here I won't go into too much details because basically I explained this in the previous slide. These maps basically illustrate what I discussed before. They show the geographic distribution of disasters across districts by the disaster type. So flood is the bottom panel. The figure shows flood in the other the one that is on the top that shows other disasters. What you can see is that floods are widespread again, while other types of disasters tend to be more regionally concentrated. The key point is that exposure varies, especially, which is something we exploit in our empirical analysis. That's why these are important. So next slide, please. Again, these maps just show the spatial distribution of the disasters again, but this time they illustrate how these patterns evolve over time in the pool data set as well. So the main takeaway is persistence. Many districts experience repeated exposure over time. Like I said before, disasters are not isolated shocks, but part of an ongoing risky environment, sort of. Next slide, please. And this takes us to the empirical work. Now that we know the data a little bit, I will introduce the empirical analysis. I'll start with a very simple baseline specification. What we do is estimate the causal relationship between disaster exposure and household outcomes using this equation. Here in this equation, the outcome variable is y, which is what we estimate, capturing things like food security and welfare measures that we predefined. For example, food consumption scores, RCSI, and other welfare measures like income and farm revenue. The key variable of interest is Z here, which is, as we discussed, a binary indicator for whether the household was exposed to natural disaster. It takes the value of 1 if it is exposed in the survey, 0 otherwise. And then we include a fairly rich set of controls denoted here by X. Like I said, these include many household characteristics. So the idea is to compare households that are similar in observable characteristics, but differ in whether they were exposed to a disaster. That's what the Z variable does, and that's why I call it the variable of interest. In the coefficient of interest, obviously, here is beta, which gives us the average effect of disaster exposures on household outcomes. Now, of course, estimating this equation using simple models is a starting point, but it does not necessarily give us a causal impact, and I'll explain in the next set of slides why. In next slide with that, please, can you take us to the next slide? Yeah. So the key question is, why is this not straightforward? Why simple estimators like ordinary least square, which is one of the most common estimator, or OLS, may fail to estimate the desired effects of disasters? The three main challenges is, well, first, selection bias. If I could simply define selection bias in this context, I would say that households are not randomly exposed to natural disasters. People choose where to live. In certain areas like floodplains and mountainous regions are more likely to experience specific disasters. And this results in the group of household that is exposed versus that are those that are not exposed to be systematically different from each other. So it may not be a fair comparison between affected and non-affected households, since they may already differ before the disaster occur, before we begin with everything. Second is something more common in data sets like this is a concept called endogeneity, which introduces a bias if we estimate that equation. One, what is endogeneity in simple terms? It's a disaster exposures may be correlated with factors that we do not directly observe in the data that also affect our outcome variables specified by Y in that equation. For example, two households may experience the same flood, but one has better coping ability due to unobserved factors like savings or maybe informal support networks. So if we don't observe these factors, we may wrongly attribute differences in outcome only to disaster. And this creates that endogeneity issue. So basically, if we estimated equation one, it may be biased. The whole impact estimated by beta may not be completely attributable to disasters only. So we have to account for these issues because of the data set that we have. I'll come back to this, explain some more in the next slide. And third, with this type of data sets is the fact that we lack a credible counterfactual. We don't directly observe what would have happened to affected households if they had not been exposed. Under ideal condition, for example, such as randomized control trial or RCT, we would randomly assign households to treatment in control groups, which we also refer to them as affected and non-affected groups. So that disaster exposures is is purely random and unrelated to household characteristics. That would be the ideal situation. The key idea that the two groups would be identical on average before the shock, if we were to do an RCT. And any differences in outcomes could be attributed to the disaster itself. However, in reality, and given the data set we have, we do not observe a credible counterfactual. We don't directly observe what would have happened to affected household if they had not been exposed, right? So to make this more simple and concrete, households choose where they live, often based on economic opportunities or environmental conditions. So disaster-prone areas are not randomly populated. This means that the difference we observe between affected and non-affected households may reflect underlying differences, not just the impact of disaster, as I said before. And this is why simple matters like OLS, which do not consider these issues, may lead to misleading results. Take us to the next slide, please. Okay. So again, I would like to briefly touch up on the endogeneity, where it comes from. Well, there could be many sources. I just wanted to mention some of these. One important issue would be unobserved heterogeneity. Households are different. There may be local factors like cultures, institutions, or informal networks that affect both exposures and the outcome. So second is behavioral adaptation. Households that experience repeated shocks may just adjust their behavior over time. So in short, it could make recovery easier for them. They may change consumption patterns or develop better coping strategies. This mean they learn from past experiences. Sorry. What we observe is already an outcome, in a way, from the past shocks. Third is obviously, as I mentioned and showed in those maps, is the geography of disasters, which is inherently non-random. Floods occurs in specific floodplain areas, landslides more commonly in mountainous areas. And these areas may differ systematically in terms of livelihoods and opportunities, again introducing a bias into our data set. And finally, the impacts as well as recovery themselves may depend on local and economic development conditions. So the same shock can have different impacts depending on the context. So overall, both exposure and outcomes are shaped by underlying factors, which complicates causal inference in this context, and in that baseline equation that we defined before. Take us to the next slide, please. And here I want to talk about the estimation approaches given against that backdrop and context. Still we start with the baseline estimator, which is OLS in instrumental variable or two-stage least square to get average effects. But the main method we rely on is what we call endogenous switching regression model. I'll refer to it as ESR from this point onward. The intuition behind ESR is quite straightforward. It allows to model two things simultaneously. First, the probability of being exposed to a disaster, which is what the first equation does. And second, the outcome under different regimes. It takes the data and assign households to different regimes, sort of, if you would like to say that. Conditional on the first stage, which is exposure to the disaster. That is for both affected and non-affected households. So instead of forcing a single equation, we allow the data to generate different outcome processes. Mainly the one that I mentioned, it creates a counterfactual scenario and sort of mimics like we have collected the data using a more experimental setup like RCT. I already, so mentioned the counterfactuals. I won't spend much time on any more than this on this slide. Can you please take us to the next slide? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So in addition to the ESR, the endogenous switching regression, which is our preferred method, we also used something called propensity score matching, which is another common method in this sort of situation. In addition to the ESR, it's mainly as a robustness check. The idea here is simple and maybe more intuitive. PSM construct a matched sample of household that are similar in observable characteristics, such as household education, household size, access, etc., but only differ in exposure to disasters. So we sort of put similar households into the same group and then compare the two groups together. We use, this is a more technical aspect of it. We use several matching algorithms, including nearest neighbor and kernel matching, which is just different sort of matching for the households based on, again, unobservable characteristics. The idea of PSM is not to fully solve the endogeneity problem. I want to make sure that this is it. It just complements the ESR approach, and it provides a benchmark where treated in control household or the affected and non-affected households are made comparable in terms of, again, observable characteristics. Like education, like household head age, etc. This allows us to check whether the mean results are driven purely by compositional differences or across households. So in combination with the preferred framework, which is the ESR model, which accounts for both unobserved heterogeneity under stronger structure, PSM also provides an additional layer of robustness. If both methods give similar results, then that strengthens our confidence in sort of in the findings. Can you take us to the next slide, which is the identification strategy? What this is, I'll make this more simple. So we defined the endogenous switching regression, which is our preferred methodology in the previous slide. But for that to work, to be credible, we need something called instrumental variables, a type of variables that affect disaster exposure, or that variable Z, but do not directly affect household outcomes, which is that variable Y in that equation, the first equation we designed. For instrument or instrumental variables, we use two main types of instruments. The first is what we call leave out means. This is the share of households in the same district that are affected by natural disasters, excluding the household itself. The idea is that this captures local exposures to shock while removing any mechanical correlations with household own outcome. The second is something what we call is Lobell type instruments. These are internally generated using heteroscedasticity in the data, or that variation in the error term, essentially exploiting variation in the error terms, denoted by that epsilon in the first equation, to generate instruments. This is particularly useful in settings like this, where strong external instruments are hard to find. It's always difficult to find instrumental variables, a variable that affects Z but not Y. So together, these two approaches help strengthen our identification or estimation, if you like to say. Please take us to the next slide. I won't spend much time on this. We have ways in several diagnostic tests that we can use to test these instruments. What we are trying to test is the validity of the instruments, which we have already discussed, which is that they should be correlated with the endogenous variable, which is exposure to disaster, but not correlated to the outcome variables. So we can use different sort of setup econometric tests to make sure that the instruments are valid. Can you please take us to the next slide so I can present the results now, finally. I'll start with the comparison between the OLS and the 2SLS, which is the instrumental variable estimate. As discussed before, as a starting point, we still use OLS and 2SLS as baseline models. The OLS results suggest that natural disasters worsen food security and welfare outcomes. which is what we would expect. But some other effects are relatively small, in a few cases, maybe not statistically significant. Now, when we move to two SLS, which again kind of to an extent address those problems we defined before, endogeneity, and this picture becomes more clearer, showing the potential problems in the data set. The estimates becomes consistently larger in magnitude, and this is important. It suggests that OLS, or that basic estimator or methodology, is actually understating the true impact of disaster. In other words, once we account for the fact that the exposure is not random, the negative impacts of exposure become stronger and bigger. So the impacts are particularly pronounced for food security indicators, dietary diversity, hunger, and coping strategy. One interesting result is that food expenditures sometimes increase even when income falls. This suggests that households are smoothing consumption, essentially reallocating their spending to protect food consumption. And this more relates to that compounding impact that I mentioned before. So the key takeaway here is that OLS gives us a useful starting point, but it's likely biased. So it further motivates that we use more robust frameworks such as the ESR that I defined before. The next slide, please, which is the ESR results, which is our main findings from our preferred methodology. Remember, the advantage of ESR framework is that it allows us to account for those problems we have in our data, which is the selection bias and endogeneity problem that we talked through in details. And it also, most importantly, it allows us to construct counterfactuals in ideal experimental situation, allowing us to estimate what effect affected household would have experienced had they not been exposed to exposures, and vice versa. So the result here, starting with food consumption measured by household food security and consumption score, which is the HFCS, we find that affected households consume about 9 points less. To put that into perspective, that is roughly equivalent to losing several key food groups over a week. And hunger measured by the HHS, we see a significant increase. In fact, a large share of households move from a little to or no hunger into moderate hunger. For coping strategies, again, the RCSI increases as well, which tells us that households are actively adjusting, skipping meals, reducing portions, maybe relying on less prepared foods. On the welfare side, we see that household income and farm revenues declined significantly by around 30 to 40%. So these are not small effects. These are economically meaningful changes in household welfare. And importantly, these results are consistent with what we saw with 2SLS. Remember that framework also addressed partially the estimation biases. Next slide, please. In this table is basically what we explained in the previous slide. We show the estimated treatment effects, which is more details on what I just discussed. So next slide, please, which is the PSM results, which is an alternative method that I discussed before. It's a robustness check. Shortly, I would say that the result from the PSM framework remains qualitatively similar with what we found using the ESR framework, meaning that the direction of the effect is the same, which is negative. Although it might be different in magnitude, this is smaller in magnitude because we are not accounting for endogeneity problems in the data. So the fact that PSM results align with the ESR gives us additional confidence in finding. Next slide. Okay, so in this slide, I look at whether these effects, that's the third research question we define, that these effects vary or are different across types of householding conditions. Post-estimation, we disaggregate or isolate the estimation treatment effects by exposure to additional shocks and by location, for example, rural versus urban. So basically what we do is we disaggregate that impact to see how rural households, to what extent rural households and urban households are affected in households that also experience additional shocks. And here is one important result that shock tend to compound. Households that experience additional shocks, such as conflict, price increases, or weather shocks, are significantly worse up. In particular, we see stronger effects on coping strategies, hunger, and farm income. So households are not just dealing with one shock. They are often dealing with multiple overlapping shocks. That's why. We also find that rural households are more vulnerable, which makes sense given their reliance on agriculture and more limited access to coping mechanism. So the key takeaway here is that while vulnerability is cumulative in compounding, the more shocks household face, the worse the outcomes get. Next slide, please. So this is basically what I talked about in the previous slide, but putting it on a table, just so to show you what these disaggregated treatment effects look like by different groups. What you can see is that when household, again, face additional shocks, that is moving from shock equal to 0 to shock equal to 1, the effect become larger. This is especially clear for coping strategies and hunger indicators. And the pattern is even stronger in rural areas. So again, this just reinforces the idea of compounding vulnerability. Next slide, please. We also carried additional robustness checks just to make sure that our mean results hold. First, we re-estimate the ESR model using only external instrument. Again, those are the leave-out means. If you remember, I explained two sets of instruments, and to put it short, the results are unchanged and unaffected, qualitatively at least. We also try to do different sort of analysis, which is the most important robustness check here. We conduct community level analysis this time. Remember, so far what we did was the analysis at the household level. This means that the primary unit of analysis was household. So in this case, we aggregate the household data variable to the community, or remember the Shora level, using means of each variable within each community. And this basically convert the household level data set to a community level data set. The important point here is that it gives us a pseudo panel data set. And I mentioned the funnel data set would have been better in the beginning. So we don't have a household level data set, but we sort of created community level panel data set, which then allows us to implement a different set of econometric models, like the commune level fixed effect model. Again, when we estimate a community level models, when we carry out community level analysis, the results remain largely qualitatively consistent with the results that we estimated from the main ESR model, which reinforces our robustness. And next slide, please, to the main findings. Where I sort of wrap up and summarize the main findings. First of all, Afghanistan is highly exposed to natural disasters. In these exposures, what we find, what our research shows, interact with poverty and conflict as well. Second, disasters have clear and significant impacts on food security, worsen food security indicators and household welfare. We see decline in dietary diversity, increase in hunger, and greater reliance on coping strategies. Third, where there are substantial welfare effects as well measured or proxied by income and farm revenue, which falls significantly by as much as 30 to 40%. In food expenditure, responses are a little bit different, mixed, suggesting that households are adjusting in coping rather than simply reducing consumption. Next slide, please. So what, putting it together, what does the evidence show so far? So stepping back, what does all this tell us? First, the results are consistent across multiple estimation strategies, which is one of the key point we're trying to make here, is to make sure that given the data, our results are robust, not biased. Like I mentioned, we employed several methods, including OLS, IV, which is the instrumental variable, the ESR framework, the PSM, even the community level analysis, all of which are consistent, at least qualitatively. Second, the more preferred methods, particularly the ESR, show larger effects, basically because they account for some issues that I have been talking about in the data, in the data set, which is the selection and the endogeneity problems. Which suggests that simpler methods that are used so far in the literature may have underestimated the true impact of these disasters. And third, the effects are not uniform. They are stronger for poorer rural households and those exposed to multiple shocks. So the key message here is that climate shocks have real, significant, and unequal impacts. And that takes us to the policy implication slide. Thanks for changing the slide. Well, let me conclude with some policy implications that can be directly derived from our results, or that our results could be used as indicative evidence to inform policy recommendations. First, our results point to targeting specific vulnerable populations. What I mean by this is that disaster response should prioritize vulnerable households. We already identified those, particularly households in the rural and agricultural areas. Secondly, there's a clear need to strengthen post-disaster support. This includes perhaps food assistance, cash transfers, and broader social protection mechanisms. Third, we need to talk about, obviously, resilience. This means investing in early warning systems, infrastructure, in agricultural adaptation. So not just responding to shocks, but preparing for them beforehand, which will improve recovery. Fourth, measurement of indicators matters both for policy and implications for the future research. Using multiple indicators provide a more comprehensive picture of food security, as relying on a single indicator may be misleading or insufficient. This approach is also supported by previous literature. Multidimensional indicators for food security are preferred when assign the scope of food security or food insecurity. So remember, food security is a multidimensional concept relating to, well, availability, access, utilization, and stability. So multiple indicators in this context is providing a much better picture. And finally, context matters, both when we are estimating the potential impacts of shocks or when we think about post-recovery from shocks. And so it is relevant to future policy. This suggests that policies should recognize context, be tailored to a specific context. For example, policies should take into account the interaction between climate shocks, like disasters, in conflict in such a type of setting. So policies isolating the impact of or addressing the impact of climate shocks would not be inclusive. It would leave too many loose ends. So overall, the effective policy, like I said, in this context, requires an integrated approach, combining immediate support with longer-term resilience building in a highly fragile context like Afghanistan. And that concludes our today's presentation. Thank you for your patience. I welcome your questions and comments now.
Great, thank you, Hayat. I don't know if my video works, but I'll kind of summarize some of the questions here. I think there are some that are about the paper you presented, and then there are some broader ones. So maybe starting with the paper. Well, I guess I'll start with the simple question that I have, which is you mentioned floods are 70% of the shocks or the disasters that occur in the country. Do you think that the policy response or the impact on the households would be different for those shocks versus other types of shocks? And were you able to kind of split and look at whether it was a flood or something else?
Yes, it's a good question. Well, first of all, it points to the geography. The question is directly related to the We already identified that floods are, for example, more concentrated in certain parts of the country. Earthquakes and other disasters, but floods are more country widespread. So future policies, first of all, might consider that aspect, the vulnerability of the households based on their location. It also has different impacts. Floods, for example, has more severe impacts on agricultural areas in agricultural activities. Earthquakes and other disasters are more, the impacts is more casualties and other financial losses. So one would expect that the policies would be different in scope and in magnitude to target that particular geography or particular sort of impact. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. I also wondered, related to that, there's been a few waves of surveys since the surveys you're using in your study. Are those useful, or are those they don't have enough information on the shocks experience or the food coping strategies? Or I know there's different different designs of different surveys that DHS.
Yes, so most of the surveys that are available, again, conducted by the CSO or the NISA throughout, starting from 2005, I think, until 2019. The latest survey wasn't out, especially with the recent changes in the country, so we did not include that. But largely, some of the surveys we could not use, unfortunately, because of the compatibility issues across the surveys or inconsistency in terms of measuring the key variables. So, for example, one survey collects just a flood, that is 2016 and 17 survey, not other disasters. While our key variable of interest here is a binary variable that indicates if a household experience all those shocks.
Okay.
So incompatibility in
Yeah.
short.
Okay. There was one question here on the Q&A that I think you addressed a little bit after this question came in, but not entirely, which is just how do you translate findings of the study into a proactive framework that can help prepare rather than respond to crises? So I guess you did touch on some of that, but if you had the magic wand and you could sort of provide a framework to prepare for crises, what would you focus on?
I would say resilience, building resilience. Afghanistan is largely an agricultural community, and building social capital at the community level. This paper basically helps us understand what is the magnitude of those shocks, and it sort of tells the policymakers that this is important and the impacts are considerable given the context because there's other shocks experienced by households as well. So like the doctor says, prevention is better than treatment. So I would go with resilience building, especially for agricultural communities, that would help them be less affected in a way, as well as improve their recovery from after the shocks.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Sayed about just more generally Afghanistan relative to other countries. How much of the food insecurity in Afghanistan is related to it being a landlocked country, and how much does it um, collaborate with other landlocked countries to address the sort of specific challenges that come from that constraint?
Obviously, the geographic location of Afghanistan may be relevant here. It's not something I do,
Mm-hmm.
directly in my analysis. But given trade routes, trade with other countries, especially in case of Afghanistan, which is landlocked, the geography sort of is affected beyond Afghanistan, the geography, Pakistan, in these countries are affected by conflict as well. Trade is something that is related to markets, obviously, that could affect prices, could lead to price shocks, which is something we directly do in this analysis. Could relate to again to several aspects of the food security. As I mentioned, food security is a multidimensional um, um, uh, phenomenon because it tackles availability, it tackles access, it tackles utilization, and it's also about stability. So that stability, access, and everything could be related to the geography of Afghanistan in general.
Okay. I think we're just about at time, so I just want to thank you again. It's very like a very important and difficult problem to study, and I think the fact that you've combined a bunch of different approaches to help sort of increase the confidence in the causal effects is very very strong. So it was an interesting paper, and thanks again for presenting to us.
Thank you very much. In fact, the most of the analysis I did, you are aware of it, is most of it is very technical. So I try to put together slides that are as friendly as possible to make sure that I can convey the message the best way I could.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you for to everyone for participation and for engagement.